Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Abstracts. And today I'm joined by David Little. So, hello, David Little. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I'll have introduced you briefly in the text alongside this episode, but would you mind giving a brief introduction to who you are?
Well, as you've said, I'm David Little, and as your viewers will quickly realize, I'm not Irish, though I'm sitting in Dublin, but English. I'm English by birth and education, but I've been all my working life in Dublin at Trinity College, where I started in the German department way back at the end of the 1960s. And I then, 10 years later, had the opportunity to set up a new Center for Language and Communication Studies, which combined the functions of a language center, a department of linguistics, and a research institute. And I remained in charge of that until 2005. Then we had some restructuring, and the last 3 years before I retired, I was head of the School of Linguistics, Speech and Communication Sciences. That, I think, is my career in about 5 sentences.
Wonderful. No, that was very concise. So we're going to talk about an article that you have written about language learner autonomy today. But before we go on to that, I'd like to dig in a little bit more about some of your personal experiences. And I learned from reading the article that you had studied foreign languages yourself at various points in your life, and you also did training as a teacher of German. I wonder if you could talk a little more about those language learning and teaching experiences.
Yes, certainly. I began to learn my first foreign language in 1953, which was coronation year in the UK. Queen Elizabeth II was crowned that year. So that gives you some idea how long ago I started. This was at a grammar school in the south of England, and we were taught by the grammar translation method. In other words, the assumption was that you learned a language by memorizing vocabulary, learning grammatical rules, and using the rules to put the words together. But we did that mostly in writing. In other words, most of the teaching was focused on grammatical drilling by translating English sentences into French, and sometimes the other way around, but mostly not. And the spoken language really played no role at all in the learning. Well, we had a few sort of formal greetings at the beginning of each class. You know, the teacher would come and say, bonjour la classe, and we would say, bonjour monsieur. And I think he gave us each a French name. I remember my name was Edouard because he said no one in France was called David, which isn't true. But there was no spoken language in our teaching and learning at all, and until several years later, when we began in alternate years to get a language assistant. And this unfortunate would be a university student from France, and he would be given small groups of us and would have to try to lure us into some kind of French conversation. But we were hopelessly, well, I must say that I was a good boy and I tried very hard and didn't do too badly. But most of the boys weren't interested and hadn't got in because it wasn't part of what we did. But I did well enough in French, and then in the sixth form, I learned German. We didn't have a German teacher up until then, but then we got one. So I did O-level in 1 year and A-level in the second year and scholarship level in the third year. That meant that I could go on to university, Oxford, to study modern languages, which in Oxford mostly entailed 2 languages. So I was able to do German and French, and German was my major language. But the approach to language teaching was identical to what I'd experienced at school. And so was the general sort of teaching and learning framework, in the sense that we had lectures in English, and we had tutorials in English. I said I was a good boy, and I used to read the very substantial literature syllabus in both languages in the original languages. But I know a lot of my fellow students read as far as possible in translation, and so still, you see, there was no spoken language in any of it. I remember one of my contemporaries upbraiding one of our lecturers and saying, but we never hear, I can't remember whether it was French or German, I think it was German, we never hear German spoken. Oh, he said, if you want to speak German, go to a Berlitz, the language school. So, I mean, this was, of course, arrogant, but it was also ignorant, because it was detaching the main organ, after all, of language learning and language use, which is the oral language, from the center of the educational process. And so by the time I graduated, I was really, in my view, quite seriously deficient in the spoken language in both languages. And I never made it up in French, because I didn't ever have a period of residence. I mean, in those days, study abroad was how you improved your spoken language, because there was no way of doing it in an Anglophone educational context. German was a bit better, but I didn't ever have the experience of studying German through German, so that my conversational German, though it in due course became very fluent, was never an academic German. And I think that was a very, very serious educational lack, and something that the UK system should be ashamed of and blamed for, and certainly the University of Oxford. When I visited Oxford some years ago now, but after I retired, I found exactly the same complacency, exactly the same attitudes, and things hadn't moved on in 50 years. I mean, it's appalling, really, wow, when you stop to think about it. So anyway, I landed in Dublin as a junior lecturer in German. And again, it was the same thing. You know, we had language classes, which were effectively translation classes conducted in English. And I realized that this wasn't good. And I tried to change it. And we moved away from translation and did various more interesting things. But essentially that was the system. And to a considerable degree, it goes on still in Anglophone universities, and I just don't understand what they think they're at, to be honest. But then after I'd been in Dublin about 10 years, I had the opportunity to set up this new Centre for Language and Communication Studies, and that took me away from German and towards, well, I was able to focus much more on language learning and teaching, and became a sort of applied linguist.
And is that the self-access center that you referred to before?
Yes. When we set up this center, it was actually physically based around new language laboratory installations, because they were the key thing back in those days, in a completely new arts and social sciences building. And I had quite close contact with the person in charge of the language centre at the University of Cambridge, who was John Trim, who was a towering figure in European work, Council of Europe work especially. And he was getting a great deal of mileage out of self-access, self-instructional language learning. He'd gradually built up an enormous library of materials of various kinds, and this was open to any member of the university who wanted to brush up their language or prepare for a field trip or whatever. And we didn't aspire to that kind of breadth, but we did offer a range of possibilities for students, whether they were language students or students of other subjects, to come and use the facilities. And I suppose that was my first encounter in a rather informal and partial way with the concept of autonomy.
Right.
I was setting up the Centre for Language and Communication Studies in 1979, and that was the year in which the Council of Europe published Henri Olek's report, Autonomy in Foreign Language Learning. It took me a year or two to catch up with it, but I mean, I at that time, I thought, as many people still do, that autonomy is a matter of self-instruction, and that it was a matter of students managing without a teacher and doing things on their own. In due course, of course, largely under the impact of my getting to know Leni Dam and her work, I came to see that it wasn't a matter of students doing things for themselves, but doing things on their own, but rather doing things for themselves, but as members of a learning community.
So since you mentioned Leni Dam, that can be a nice little segue into talking a bit more about her and that aspect of your work in the paper that is going to be the main focus of our discussion today, which was it was published in 2022, and it was called Language Learner Autonomy, Rethinking Language Teaching, and it was published in the Language Teaching Journal by Cambridge, and it's part of the first person singular series, and I enjoyed reading it very much, and I think the listeners or viewers would feel the same. And you mentioned you mentioned getting to know Leni Dam and her ideas, and in the piece you mentioned attending a seminar of hers in 1985. Can you set the scene a little bit, what that was like?
Yes, very willingly. As I've explained, in 1979, I was appointed director of this new centre. And it was sui generis. There wasn't anything else like it in the university sector in Ireland, and people were very interested in it. And so, of course, suddenly I was labelled as a great expert on language learning and teaching. At the same time, we were trying within our school system to move the Department of Education, the ministry, which was responsible for curricula and so on in those days, towards more communicative approaches to teaching and learning via reforms of syllabuses and exams. And a group of second and third level teachers, language teachers, that got together arising from some conference or other. And we used to meet regularly to work on these various reforms. And one of the groups within our larger group focused on French, and they created a best-selling French course, a 3-year French course starting from the beginning. So it coincided with the junior cycle of secondary education. And it was hugely successful. The publisher managed to get it into practically every school. And so it generated in its first year an enormous royalty. And the problem was that our group had no legal constitution. And the people who inherited, I suppose, the royalty, it was the Linguistics Institute of Ireland, because we used to meet on their premises. They provided us with free anyway, they got this royalty, and they grandly allowed us to use it to bring various language teaching gurus to Dublin to do weekend seminars with us. I'd better not mention all of them, because most of them I found to be not very helpful, but they were big names then, and some of them still are now. But then Leni Dam came, and she was already becoming well known internationally for the work she was doing under the general label of learner autonomy in the school where she taught, which was a Danish middle school. So kids from sort of lower secondary 10 or 11 through till 15, 16, when they go on to upper secondary, if they're continuing in that more academic strand. So That's the general background, and we were focused on communicative language teaching, and we'd read some of the key texts, and we were. I still didn't think I wasn't at all confident that I knew how I could get other people to learn a language. I still felt fairly fraudulent as a teacher, because I knew it wasn't a matter of telling them, but I wasn't quite sure what else you had to do if you couldn't simply tell them. But then Leni showed us. She talked for quite a long time, I seem to remember. But then she began to show us some of the materials she brought with her. She had learner logbooks. I mean, all her learners from day one each had a logbook, a simple exercise book, a copybook, in which they logged their learning lesson by lesson, and also wrote their various homeworks and so on. And she had posters, because she made a lot of use of posters. And these she pinned up on the wall. And then she had videos, and that was back in 1985, quite advanced technologically. I remember, there were multiple video formats, and she'd announced that she was bringing videos, but it wasn't straightforward to lay our hands on a machine that would enable us to play them back.
Right.
But we did. And she showed us these videos, and they were, of course, black and white and rather muddy, not especially in focus. But that was really when the scales fell from my eyes. I suddenly saw what was happening here. She'd found a way of getting these kids to interact among themselves, working in small groups in English. And of course, one of the things that I've been particularly focused on ever since is how you do that, starting on day one, and gradually draw your learners into this never-ending target language dialogue. So they were talking English to one another, and they were doing that with confidence and great fluency. And these were kids in their second and third year of learning English. And when I set that beside my own experience, which I've briefly described to you, or the experience that I knew most of my students in the university would have been going through, then I realized that she was onto something that really was very different. At the same time, I was slightly scandalized, because we'd learned as communicative sort of disciples that translation was out and various other hallowed exercises. But in fact, it was very interesting to see how much of their time her learners spent translating stuff, especially from Danish into English, fairy tales and that kind of thing, because these learners were young teenagers and not yet cynical about fairy tales and sort of junior versions of fantasy. But it was very, very exciting being in this. I remember I had a dreadful cold and sore throat and was feeling really not well, and yet very excited. And in her introductory talk, Leni mentioned a book which for her had become a sort of Bible. And it was Douglas Barnes's From Communication to Curriculum, which I still regularly reread and consult, and which seems to me one of the great pedagogical insights that has been published in my lifetime. Barnes is not, of course, talking about language teaching. He's talking about teaching and learning generally. But he, at the center of his sort of argument, is the idea that no learners of any age come to a learning context as blank slates. they come with what he calls action knowledge,
Right.
which is a complex of experiential knowledge, beliefs, expectations, attitudes, and all the rest of it. And the task for education is to find ways of elaborating that action knowledge with curriculum content, bringing curriculum content into fruitful interaction with what the kids already know, so that the impact of education is that gradually what you learn formally elaborates your action knowledge, and in some cases may make it more sharply focused, critical, and so on and so forth. And I mean, I've always found that a hugely persuasive argument, and latterly with the work I've been doing with learners from immigrant families here in Ireland, it's a very good way of getting a handle on the particular challenge they find, because they come from a family where a variety of English is not the home language.
Right.
They come with action knowledge that they've acquired through another language. And what you've got to do is to find ways not only of melding their action knowledge with curriculum content, but in doing that, give them access to and gradually fluency in the language of schooling.
Right. Yes, I'd like to come back to that part about the work that you've done, since that's interesting. But for the moment, we've been just kind of dancing around the word autonomy. You mentioned it a few times. What does that mean as far as you're concerned? The word autonomy.
It means doing things for yourself. It means doing things for yourself because whatever it is you're doing, you accept responsibility for. Because you accept responsibility, you think about what you're doing, because you can't meaningfully accept responsibility without reflection. And because you're accepting responsibility and thinking about what you're doing, you're also constantly monitoring the effectiveness of what you're doing, and in one way or another evaluating how it's going, and so on and so forth. That's essentially a dynamic of autonomous behavior. And of course, I'm interested in it when it's enacted within a formal learning context.
And so that formal learning context most often is a classroom.
Yeah,
it's out from the.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing perhaps I might have added to that is that it's easiest to be those kinds of things when one's a member of a community rather than simply being on one's own. And the, I mean, I learned, one of the early lessons I learned from getting to know Leni Dumm's work and her classroom and so on, is that autonomy is only valuable as an individual phenomenon to the extent that it is also realized and has value as a relational phenomenon.
Okay.
In other words, in an effective autonomy classroom, you have got a group of learners, each of whom is developing an individual autonomy, but they're doing that by relationally and collectively developing autonomy as a learning community.
So it's kind of interdependent.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So that's that conceptual level of autonomy brought down to the level of the language classroom is as a community.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned some of the things that struck you from participating in the seminar with Leni Dumm and seeing these various kinds of evidence that she'd brought along the students' production, especially written. You mentioned. What's the role of production in this autonomy classroom, particularly like writing, you mentioned?
I think I can best answer that question by opening it up very slightly.
Okay.
A pedagogy that is oriented towards language learner autonomy seems to me to have 7 features. This is the latest version of my gospel. The first feature is that the teacher from the very beginning engages the learners in a never-ending dialogue that is conducted in the target language.
Okay.
On the other side, from the beginning, the teacher is intent on developing learners' skills of self-management, which means giving them responsibility, giving them choice, giving them control within the limits of their capacity to exercise those things. Now, in order for the learners to engage in this never-ending dialogue, they have got to learn bits of language, that's evident. And writing is the means by which they do that. In Lenie's classroom, for example, one of the early things she has her learners doing is learning the words that they want to learn, because that will enable them to refer to their interests. And so they create these little word cards, little slips of paper. On one side, they write the word in English, in this case, that they want to learn, and on the reverse, either a Danish equivalent or a little drawing or whatever. And from there, they progress to creating picture dominoes and various other learning materials. They create the learning materials themselves. A lot of them they do individually, but working in groups. And this creates a learning resource for the class as a whole, so that as they gradually learn the words that are important to them, they're also learning the words that are important to their classmates. Mm-hmm. And what you're developing then is a sort of that characterizes the interests of the learning community. And that's where you begin to get this relational autonomy working. So what I'm saying so far is that you depend on writing, technology, to capture bits of the target language in order that you can learn them, in order that you can participate more fully in this ongoing dialogue that the teacher is leading you through lesson by lesson. At the same time, you have your learners creating little texts. In Lenie's class, in the very first lesson, she would give her learners a text frame, a simple text frame. My name is, I live, and so on and so forth. And they would call out in Danish the things they needed to be able to say to write this little text. And she would, without comment, simply write on a sheet of paper on the wall, a poster, the English equivalents. They would copy that down and then write this text about themselves. So that from the very beginning, they're supporting their learning by teaching themselves the words that are important to them, to express their interests and so on. But they're also using the language to express themselves, to give a little account of themselves. And this is, of course, fundamental to any concept of autonomy, because you're drawing the language out of them in the sense of rooting it in their personalities and interests. So you've got those two uses of writing to support participation in the dialogue on the one side, and to give the dialogue a purpose on the other, because from little texts about myself and so on, learners quickly move forward to more ambitious group activities, for example, creating little plays and so on. Mm-hmm. And these activities are what makes the whole thing have a purpose anyway. So that's on that side. But on the other side, when it comes to learning to manage their learning and so on, that's where the logbooks come in. And from the beginning, as I have explained, Lenie's learners had a logbook in which they kept a running record of every lesson, in which they also wrote short texts that they created for themselves. And these logbooks, our 2017 book has numbers of examples. Mm-hmm. You can see how sophisticated these become after 2 or 3 years of learning. And what all this means is that there is a constant interdependence between speaking and writing, writing and speaking, the spoken language and the written language. And that, it seems to me, is the biggest single factor underlying the success that this particular approach achieves. Because from a very early stage, it's no big deal about talking the language. You need all kinds of supports to do it, but you do it. And there's also no big deal about writing the language. Because another thing that was seriously deficient in my education was anything that gave me genuine fluency in writing French or German.
Right.
Because I wasn't doing it all the time.
Right.
Excuse me. But these kids and others like them in other contexts that I'm familiar with are the whole time writing the target language to support their speaking to help to generate written text, and the interdependence between these two is very, very tight. And then the big issue, because teachers always want to know, what about grammar? Well, in this particular pedagogy, grammar is essentially orthography. In other words, learners gradually become more correct in their syntax and morphology as a result of practice. But they learn to focus on linguistic form by focusing on the surface correctness of what. So grammar as orthography, that's maybe slightly an exaggeration, but you see where I'm coming from.
Right. So yes, in the piece you mentioned this phrase, or you use the phrase language learning and language use are two sides of the same coin. Yes. It's what you're talking about.
Yes, and I mean, I think what I've just said is an indirect explanation of what I mean by that. In the account I've just given you of the pedagogical approach, you can't become an autonomous language user without being an autonomous learner, and you can't develop as an autonomous learner without being an autonomous user. Those two things are totally interdependent.
Right. And the role of the logbooks in this is promoting some kind of reflection alongside language use.
Yes, it's multiple. I mean, the act of writing in the logbook is focusing necessarily on linguistic form. I mean, you can't write anything without being aware that you're converting sounds into marks on a page. You might not think of it like that, but you can't. The Canadian excuse me, literacy scholar David Olson made the point several decades ago now that there's a sense in which writing is metalinguistics. Metalinguistics, as we understand it, is very difficult to conceive of without writing systems. So by writing in logbooks the whole time, these learners are, I mean, they're thinking about what they're writing, and they're writing it down, and they may be reading it aloud. So you get this tight interconnection, interdependence of writing and speaking. And in doing this, of course, they're creating a resource that they can draw on.
Right.
Where they get, either they're doing group work or they're drawn into a teacher whole class interaction. They can share what they've written in their logbooks with one another. This gives them raw material to talk about in the target language. And then cumulatively, through time, you've got an extraordinary record documentation of the learning process, because it's lesson by lesson, moment by moment.
Right.
And this is a very, very powerful aid to memory.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a tendency these days, of course, to think that it's better to do everything digitally. But there is a certain amount of research, some of which I've read, that argues that handwritten notes are much more effective supports to learning than making probably more detailed notes on a tablet or laptop or whatever. And when it comes to language learning, I'm sure the same applies. I mean, if you've got this logbook in front of you and it's continuous and it goes from lesson to lesson, you've got a degree and a power of engagement that you won't get in any other way, I think.
Right. And so we've got the use of the language that you want to learn. You've got the learners deciding what it is that they want to write about, because it's being generated by them and they're kind of reflecting on what they do, and it's a kind of virtuous cycle there, all kind of mediated by writing about it, which you are saying is a kind of metalinguistic act, which is improving their syntax, lexis, vocabulary, their active vocabulary, as they're engaging in this process. In the paper, you write that this approach makes many of the traditional debates that occur in applied linguistics and SLA irrelevant. What did you mean by that when you wrote that?
Well, one of my chief gripes about applied linguistics and instructed SLA and so on is that so much of what is published seems to start from the unexamined assumption that there's something called teaching. And you don't have to worry about teaching except what you do when you're focused on getting the kids to get the right grammar or learn vocabulary or whatever. So that there's this unexamined phenomenon called teaching. We never worry too much, except when we focus on components of it, which are brought into focus by one or another kind of empirical investigation. So it might be morphological development, or it might be, I don't know, vocabulary, whatever it is. And the problem with those things is that they never bring about any significant improvement in learning outcomes, as far as I can see. I mean, when you read articles, they tend to do a before and after test. And you know that the author has only done it for an MA thesis or something, so everybody forgot about it afterwards. And this has always seemed to me a complete and utter waste of time. Now, the approach to language teaching that I label learner autonomy, and we've been talking about in a fair degree of detail so far, is a holistic approach. And from quite an early stage in my career as a researcher of this, I was looking for ways of encapsulating it so that teachers could understand how to implement the approach on the basis of 2 or 3 fundamental principles to which they would give their own shape. So it's a teaching approach which is dialogic. It's strongly dialogic in the sense that it grants equal participation rights to all participants, even though the teacher, of course, must lead and shape it. And it goes on in the target language. And of course, it's characterized by learner involvement in terms of choice where that's appropriate, and learner control, decision making, and all of that, and of course non-stop reflection, planning, implementation, evaluation in an everlasting recursive cycle. These things, if they're thoughtfully implemented, revolutionize language learning experiences. There's no doubt about it. And I see that happen. Well, of course, in lower secondary school classrooms, I've seen it happen at all levels of schooling. It's characteristic also then of this primary school that I've worked with here in Dublin, working with children from immigrant families.
Right.
And you don't need to worry about any of the traditional focuses of applied linguistics.
Right, so it's a kind of roadmap for success then.
You need to worry about the dynamic of the dialogic dynamic that the teacher has got to create and keep running.
I see.
With the learners.
And there are a couple of other ideas that you mentioned in the piece that were connected to this idea of autonomy. There were competence and relatedness. By relatedness, I assume that you meant the kind of interrelatedness of the classroom context that you've just described as dynamic environment.
These three terms, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, are not my invention. They come from self-determination theory. And what self-determination theory claims is that human beings, as social organisms, have three fundamental motivations or drives, which are also fundamental needs. The first is autonomy. In other words, we all want to be in charge of our own agenda. But at the same time, we want to feel that we're competent in what we do. Fulfillment comes from not only setting the agenda and following it through, but excuse me, doing that with the knowledge of competence. And because we're social creatures, we also have to be able to fulfill these two needs in relation with other people. Sorry, I'm going to cough now, I think.
Not at all.
So that's where that comes from. In my own thinking about it, well, autonomy, of course, speaks for itself. The need for competence is driven in the dynamic by constant monitoring and evaluation. There's no point in being in charge of your own learning, accepting responsibility for it. You're constantly thinking about the process and its outcomes. So that's competence. And I've already talked about autonomy as a relational as well as an individual phenomenon. So that's the sort of classroom community context.
Right. No, that's useful. We can take it from the kind of more abstract theoretical level down, but the core principles are very applicable easily on a practical level by a language teacher, as you framed them. And I guess I'd like to turn now to Ireland, because you've mentioned it a few times. I'm not particularly familiar with the typical language learning environment in Ireland, and I guess perhaps a lot of people watching or listening might also be unfamiliar with it. Could you sketch out a little bit what it's like? How are languages learned in Irish schools?
Okay, I think that as far as learning languages at schools are concerned, you need to know two things.
Okay.
First of all, the first official language of Ireland is not English, but Irish. There is a diminishing population of native speakers, conservatively estimated at perhaps not much more than 50,000, who tend to live in communities on the west and southwest of the island. There are some in the northwest as well. But from the foundation of the state, just over 100 years ago, Irish has been an obligatory school subject from the beginning to the end. So children starting school at the age of 4.5 begin to learn Irish, and it's, unless you get an exemption, it's an obligatory school leaving exam subject as well.
Right.
That's the first thing to know about it. And the other thing about the structure of the school system is that we don't have the kind of narrowing of focus through secondary schooling that is characteristic of the UK and Northern Ireland, where people do 3 or 4 A-level subjects. People in our system who are aiming for university entrance will do 9 subjects for the school leaving exam. Now, within that broad framework, language learning and teaching, I have, as I'm fond of boasting, 5 grown-up children who between them spent 75 years failing to become communicatively proficient in Irish. And I now have 6 grandchildren who are going through the same experience. There are, of course, exceptions. Scolrija Kalini in Blanchardstown, about whom I've written quite a lot in collaboration with the former principal, Deirdre Kerwin, would be an outstanding example of difference here. But it's typical for kids in primary school to be taught Irish by filling in closed tests and this kind of nonsense. They never hear the language spoken because their teacher isn't proficient in the language. If you're a primary teacher qualified to teach in a primary school, then you count as qualified to teach Irish, which is insane. And so kids go through school being taught Irish through English, and the learning outcomes, there are, I have to keep emphasizing, exceptions, but they would be a minority of schools. We do also have a small Irish medium sector, and there obviously kids, whether they come from Irish-speaking families or not, become orally proficient in the language. But that is a serious stain on the country's educational reputation, and something that I'm constantly complaining about in private and in public. The Irish language is very close to death, and the education system, it was intended that it would restore the language, but the way in which the language is being taught is only hastening its death. It's doing nothing to stop that process. So that's a national disgrace. And then foreign language teaching, some of it is very good, but again, I think that's a minority experience. Again, I can only go by the experience that my own children had at school, and then currently my grandchildren. The extent to which the foreign language is a medium of teaching and learning is very limited in most classrooms, limited to non-existent, and so on and so forth. I mean, one of the embarrassments that I've been faced with over the years is having people write to me or turn up in Ireland having read what I've written about learner autonomy, and expecting me to be able to take them by the hand to classrooms where this is all blooming and proof of the pudding and so on. I mean, I could do that with Scolrija, but that was all.
So can you tell us a little bit about where your own work fits into this picture?
I was responsible about 30 years ago now for setting up an institution-wide language program in Trinity College. This was a program of foreign language modules that was open to students who weren't taking a foreign language as part of their university studies.
Okay.
And we developed those modules following the principles that I've been elaborating
I see.
for you in a fairly abstract way. In around 2000, I was able to set up as a not-for-profit campus company of Trinity College, an organization called Integrate Ireland Language and Training, which provided intensive English language courses for adult refugees and also supported the teachers responsible for developing English language proficiency of immigrant kids in the schools. And that was funded by the Irish government from 2000 until the financial crash in 2008, when it became an easy victim. They had quickly to save money, and they turned off the tap. But there again, we promoted the pedagogical principles that I've been talking about in this. And then around the turn of the millennium, I set up a Centre for Deaf Studies, which trains deaf teachers of sign language to work with, of course, hearing learners, and also sign language interpreters. And again, the development of teaching and learning culture was very much influenced by all of this work. So to say that I've had no impact, or my work has had no impact, is simply not true, because we did an enormous amount. The institution-wide program, of course, runs on. We did an enormous amount with the refugees for the 8 years we were teaching them. Dublin, we had centres around the country, and the Centre for Deaf Studies has become an international centre of research excellence, widely, well, internationally recognized. So all of those things have been, I think it's fair to say, strongly influenced by the general ethos that underpins my work. And I should also say that for 40 years, I suppose now, I've been involved in the language education work of the Council of Europe.
Okay.
Now, the Council of Europe, we mentioned Henri Olek at the beginning of this interview. And the Council of Europe began its education work as part of a larger project in adult education. So its early work on language learning was focused on adult learners and supporting mobility. The adult education project, this is back in the 1970s, emphasized very much the importance of engaging learners, drawing on the knowledge and experience they bring, using them as partners in the development of curricula and pedagogy. In other words, it was an early version of learner autonomy. And unlike Olek's work, it wasn't focused on individual learners. It was very much talking about learning as an interactive process. It talks about self-learning, by which it sort of meant learner autonomy, but it saw self-learning as something that was enacted in group work. And it saw group work as something that was shaped by what's it called? Interactional dialectical dialogue or some such thing, which is very much of the 1970s and quasi-Marxist and so on. But a lot of the work that I've done for the Council of Europe has been within that general ethos. I was very much involved in the European Language Portfolio Project, which you may or may not know about.
Yes, a little bit. A little bit. It's mentioned in the piece.
The Council of Europe developed through the 1990s the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages.
Yeah.
In parallel with that, it developed the concept of a European language portfolio, because it was still thinking about adult language learners who might want to do their own thing and develop their own learning programs. So the portfolio was originally a sort of planning and implementation tool for adult learners, but then of course it was taken over by schools, and the European language portfolio was supposed to foster learner autonomy, promote intercultural learning, and create awareness of plurilingualism. The Council of Europe has this concept of plurilingualism as the somehow integrated proficiency to operate in multiple languages.
Mm.
And of course, all of that work was very much driven by evolving understandings of language learner autonomy in practice as well as in theory. And if you look at the Council of Europe's European language portfolio website, you'll find an enormous amount of stuff, much of it written by myself, on learner autonomy and portfolio learning.
Right.
And then again, you see from 2006 to about 2017, I was a member of the Council of Europe's working group on the linguistic integration of adult migrants. And again, on the website, there are a lot of texts that I produced, and all of that is informed directly or indirectly by the things we've been talking about.
So how, taking a step back and looking at, all the portfolio work, the Center for Deaf Studies, the work with the school, the English as an additional language learners, the work with refugees and adult migrants, what can you sum up what's that done to move your understanding of autonomy on, as compared to, that when you first encountered it back in that seminar in 1985?
Well, I think everything that I've mentioned so far, but there's actually one more thing I should mention briefly before your question. I'm currently academic coordinator for a project of the Council of Europe called the Romani Plurilingual Policy Experimentation.
Okay.
And you can find out all about that by going to www.coe.lang www.coe.int/lang. That will bring you to the language policy portal of the Council of Europe. And if you go to the pull-down menu on plurilingual education, you'll find the last item on that is Romani. And if you click on that, you'll come to the web page that tells you all you could possibly want to know about this Romani work. But I mean, essentially, what this project is doing is, it goes back, of course, to the idea of action knowledge and school knowledge. It's exploring ways in which Romani language and culture can be used in the classroom to support the educational inclusion of Roma kids. And I'm working with a total of 10 schools in 3 countries, Greece, Slovakia and Slovenia. And the schools fall into 3 categories. So there are schools that have pretty well all Roma students, and the students live in settlements where they speak a variety of Romani, so they come to school with no knowledge of the language of schooling. That's one scenario. Other schools have a minority of Roma students, but the students still live in settlements, so they still come to school with no Romani. And then the third category has a minority of Roma kids who don't live in settlements, who live in the community, as it were. So you've got different kinds of challenge and different ways in which the language and culture can be brought into the classroom. But essentially, this is all about engaging these kids from where they are and taking what they've got and drawing that in, which is exactly what I understood Leni Dunn was doing when I first saw the success that she was having. And I mean, what the schools participating in this project are doing is very, very varied. But for example, a school in Volos in Greece has kids who have to learn Greek. There's Romani is mostly a spoken language. It doesn't have standard written forms. But in this school, as part of their engagement with literacy generally, in 5th and 6th grade, so kids of 11 and 12, have a newsletter club, and they create a newsletter, first of all, in Greek. So they work in groups, and the teacher guides them, and they have a lot of discussion about what's correct and what's not correct. And when they've done the Greek text, they translate it into Romani.
Okay.
But they can only do that by using the orthography and phonology of Greek, because there's no written version of Romani. So they're creating their own written language. Now, it's very difficult for those of us who've always been literate to get our heads around what an astonishing cognitive, intellectual, cultural challenge that is. And these kids are doing that, of course, under the guidance of their teacher, but they're doing that for themselves. I mean, that seems to me to be an amazing feat.
Right. No, I can see the through line there from the previous work to the work you're currently engaged in very, very clearly. In the piece you talk about, and in the book actually, the 2017 book, you talk more about these kind of long-term projects that you're engaged in. I suppose this kind of Romani plurilingualism project is another example of a long-standing thing. Why is that type of project more suitable for looking at this phenomenon of autonomy than, say, a short-term questionnaire survey with a pre-post thing that you mentioned earlier? Is it just a matter of it needs time to percolate these?
No, it's a quite different kind of thing. I mean, I think questionnaire research is largely useless, and all these questionnaires that attempt to measure autonomy, they're only generated by people needing mostly bogus data for theses and this kind of thing. I mean, a lot of these things take autonomy, which for me is a very, very complex, holistic phenomenon, as I hope this interview has to some extent communicated. But they try to divide it up. They sort of atomize it into little things, and then they try to tick these boxes and add them up and say how autonomous people say they are or aren't. None of that is remotely interesting to me. What I'm interested in is people enjoying successful learning careers case mostly in languages, but it could be anything. Successful learning careers that they are aware, enlarge them as individuals, extend their behavioral capacities, and make life more worthwhile for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the thing I'm doing for the Council of Europe, I didn't do that for research purposes.
Mm-hmm.
I did that because the Council of Europe has lots of high-level resolutions about the social and educational inclusion of Roma. And it has statements that indicate that these measures should be taken and they should produce certain positive results. But there's nothing about what you actually do in schools and classrooms that have Roma to make these things begin to work. So that's what this policy experimentation is about.
Mm-hmm.
I started by getting the language policy section to allow me to put together an expert group to create a policy document. And when we got the policy document, we recommended to the Education Committee and the Council of Europe that they should fund this small-scale project so that we could test it. And so then I, on the basis of the recommendation, produced an 80-page project handbook. And then we recruited these countries and we translated the handbook and so on. But it's not a research activity. It's if you like, an educational development activity. Mm-hmm. It's actually making a difference to people's lives.
Right, right.
I mean, I've always believed that educational research is a complete waste of time if it doesn't make some positive difference to somebody's life somewhere.
Well, it sounds like that experience that you talked about before with the Romani students creating their own written version of the language in using Greek orthography is the most kind of meaningful and special experience they could possibly have had. So I can certainly understand your point of view. You mentioned earlier feeling quite, well, I don't know if disappointed is the right word, but you mentioned your children and grandchildren and their lack of success, perhaps, in being communicative Irish users. And you were also
I should perhaps say that my children are all highly successful professional people.
Oh, yes, but we're just talking about communicative language use. Yeah.
I doesn't give the impression that they were complete failures at school.
No.
But I mean, the point is that they performed at school as school expected them to perform.
Right. So that's what I was driving at. So you were talking about.
But the school experience wasn't one that made them communicatively proficient in the languages they were learning.
Right. So what are the broader education system level changes that you would like to see to make that kind of meaningful language learning experience that those Romani students perhaps are having more translatable and more widely had?
I think, well, I mean, I think you have to have curricula and examinations that make it very clear that teaching and learning must, from the beginning, involve communication in and through the language that's being learned. You want to develop pedagogical approaches which, like the one I'm associated with, emphasizes the importance of writing and speaking as interdependent systems where developing in one brings development in the other. You want to create a sense of confidence and competence in learners that as they gradually increase in proficiency, they can do things for themselves, they can communicate for themselves, they can engage in project work, whether individually or collaboratively. I mean, all of these things are relatively easy to develop on paper, because I mean, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, you may or may not be familiar with, but it describes proficiency in languages in terms of language use. And its chief descriptive its chief descriptive instrument is the can-do descriptor. Can do this, can do that, can do the other. Now, a can-do descriptor can simultaneously identify a curriculum goal, indicate appropriate learning activity, and lay the ground for assessment procedures. And what that does is foster constructive alignment between curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment. Or, as my friend Barry O'Sullivan in the British Council talks about, you have a comprehensive learning system with curriculum, delivery, and assessment. And the Common European Framework makes that possible. And you know, putting this on paper is actually, and it's an effortful task, but it's an entirely feasible and manageable one. But what then has to happen, of course, is that there has to be a sea change in teacher education.
Okay.
Because teachers have got to be given the basic, I suppose, dialogic skills in the target language to manage the learning conversation.
Right.
And to take an extreme negative example, that's what the majority of primary teachers here in Ireland haven't got for Irish, as far as I can judge.
I see.
And until my personal view for Irish is that it's self-deceiving to say that all primary teachers are capable of teaching the language. They're not. You need a degree of spontaneous fluency in the language to be able to teach it. And I think we're long past the time when teaching Irish should be treated as a specialist skill, so that each school, depending on its size, would have 2, 3, or 4 specialist teachers of Irish who would be able to deliver the kind of learning experience that I'm talking about.
I see. I think that really fleshes out the ideas that we've been talking about in quite a concrete way. I'm also mindful of your time. You've been very generous, and we've talked for over an hour about this topic and covered quite a lot of ground. So just as one kind of final closing question, I often ask this same question to all of the guests that I have on here. What's your one piece of advice for the next generation of people following in your footsteps?
One of the problems with the literature on learner autonomy, literature on pedagogy generally, is that people think that education should be a progressive science in the way that physics and chemistry and other experimental sciences are, and of course it isn't. I am beginning to read in the literature on learner autonomy arguments that I was myself making sort of 30 or 40 years ago. So reinvention of the wheel and the desire for novelty. So a few years ago now, I read this article. Someone said that it was time to move away from an individual focus on autonomy and think in terms of autonomy as a sort of community thing. Well, I was writing that in about 1990, so there's this business of not reinventing the wheel, but I also would go back to what I said earlier in our interview, that educational research is only justified if it makes a difference to someone somewhere.
Right.
A positive difference to their learning, and as a result of that, how they feel about themselves, and the quality of their life, and so on, and so forth. Well, if you're interested in these things, you need to think about them. But if you're wanting to publish about them, then I think what you have to do is find contexts, whether you create them yourself or someone else creates them for you, contexts of good and successful practice. And then you have to study those contexts very, very closely, because that's how you learn how you can communicate the approach to other people. I have never written about learner autonomy as an aspirational phenomenon. I've always written about it as an achieved reality in particular learning contexts. So I don't have to prove that what I say about teaching and learning under the label of learner autonomy works, because I know it does, and much of what I've written has contributed to the documentation of the success, and that, it seems to me, is what should be the sort of lodestar.
Right. Wise words indeed. Particularly, I like the point about educational research should make a difference to people, to be valuable and worthwhile doing.
I think, I mean, it's very difficult for people doing master's degrees or PhD theses who are expected to undertake some kind of empirical exploration, but so much of the literature reports on short-term, small-scale projects. This LALA project that Leni Damen-Legenhausen conducted over 4 or 5 years is, to my knowledge, the only sustained longitudinal exploration of the impact of autonomous learning or learner autonomy on target language development. There's room for a great deal of replication there. But of course, it's never easy to undertake longitudinal research.
No, but
because people move away, or classes get broken up.
Yeah, it's practicality, right? But definitely some good advice for the future there. Well, I think that about wraps it up. But David Little, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom. My pleasure entirely.
All right.